Well, thank you, PLAN-Boulder, for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is Gordon McCurry. I'm a professional hydrologist who's both lived and worked in this basin for a number of years. I'll be speaking tonight on both flooding issues and flooding actions in the South Boulder Creek Basin. Some of my involvement in this basin includes doing my PhD dissertation work on the basin, looking at the effect of climate change on the flows and the water management in South Boulder Creek and Boulder Creek Basin in the early 90s. And then since that, I've worked on various advisory boards with the city looking at flooding issues on South Boulder Creek. The picture we see here is of an air view of South Boulder Creek. It comes out of the foothills at El Dorado Canyon here on the left that I'm showing with my cursor. And then the creek goes through the plains, traversing across the middle of the slide you can see here. I'd like to speak with you about a few things relating to the hydrology of Boulder Creek, including a bit about the South Boulder Creek watershed, share with you some information on historic flooding in the watershed, as we look at a picture down below of South Boulder Creek flooding during the 2013 flood, and focus on the flood mitigation plans for South Boulder Creek that are currently underway, and end with discussing other developments that are in the watershed that pertain to flooding. Here's another aerial image of the South Boulder Creek watershed. The Mile High Flood District put this figure together, and they delineated these various sub-zones of the watershed. But the South Boulder Creek watershed is outlined here in red. What's referred to here as the headwaters. The upper and the middle parts of the basin are in the foothills behind the Flatirons. And the areas of most interest to us would be what are referred to here as the lower zone. This is what issues out of El Dorado Canyon. Shown in blue near the bottom of this screen is the simulation of a typical flood, or the 100-year flood. Something that makes this basin interesting is that it's very long and narrow. You can see its area here, over 130 square miles, and the majority of that is in the headwaters and upper and middle zones, really the foothills zones. It's a remarkable basin because we have almost 8,000 feet of elevation change between the Continental Divide and where South Boulder Creek merges with Boulder Creek. South Boulder Creek occupies a little over 20 miles in the foothills area and about 10 miles within the plains. This configuration makes it very prone to flooding. And in fact, the Boulder Creek watershed, which is immediately to the right of this or to the north, has a very similar configuration. And so these two basins have a very big catchment area, being in the foothills, that doesn't have much storage capacity. So any precipitation events can run off and run down into the plains very quickly. Of course, we do have in the South Boulder Creek Basin gross reservoir, and that's shown on this slide just above the word middle. It's kind of a C-shaped reservoir, as you can see here. And likewise, then, Boulder Creek Basin has Barker Reservoir, which would be shown in the light blue oval here off of to the red. And so certainly in the South Boulder Creek watershed, gross reservoir does help ameliorate floods that occur from precipitation events upstream of that, but it doesn't help at all for any precipitation that occurs downstream of that. Let's look at some of the major floods that have occurred in South Boulder Creek historically. Here's a list of them. And this is a list, again, provided by the Mile High Flood District. And they're the management agency here in the Denver Front Range area that helps manage and mitigate flooding throughout the area, including Boulder. They compiled this list of floods that were over 1,000 cubic feet per second, or CFS, based on the gauge at El Dorado Springs. This is a stream gauge that's been recording flow continuously for well over a century. You can see that the first listing in the 1890s was from that gauge. That particular flood took out the gauge, so the flow level isn't known, but it was thought to be very severe. But you can see quite a number of floods here, leading up, of course, to the most recent flood, which was in 2013, shown at the bottom. Now, how big are these? What's the context here? Typically, flood managers look at the 100-year flood event. And at the El Dorado Springs gauge, the estimated flow rate for the 100-year event for a longer duration, lower intensity storm, which is referred to as the general storm, is 2,230 CFS. And so we can compare these recorded flows at that gauge to that number. And the ones I've shown here that are starred, the three values, 1938, 1951, and of course 2013, all exceeded that number. One thing of note, though, is that the 100-year flood does not mean that there'll be only one flood of that magnitude in 100 years. It really means there is a 1 in 100 chance or a 1% chance of a flood of that level occurring in any given year. And so you can see that we have three flows that exceeded 100 years, or the 100-year flood flow, since 1938, or in about 83 years. And so statistically, we could have more than one 100-year flood flow even in a given year. One thing of concern looking into the future is that the climate change predictions that have been modeled for decades, including work that I did in the 90s, have shown that it's likely that we'll have much more intense storms in the future due to the increased temperature and moisture content of the atmosphere. So even though we may be having more drought conditions, we also at the same time may be having more flood conditions. So the three floods we've had of greater than 100-year magnitude in the last 83 years, we're likely to see that occurrence even more frequently. Looking at a couple of the recent floods, here's an air photo of the 1969 flood. Some of you, it sounds like, were here during that event. This is a picture looking from a plane at Highway 36 and looking to the northeast off the wing of the plane. What I've shown here now dashed in yellow is the trace of South Boulder Creek. You can see if you look closely, a lot of areas are overflowed in this. The previous table showed that this was lower than a 100-year event. Something else of interest, though, and I'm highlighting it here in this red arrow, that South Boulder Creek itself, especially upstream of Route 36, doesn't have the capacity to withhold or to hold very high flow levels. This flood event was less than 100-year flood flow, but it caused the level in the creek rose above the banks, and so it spilled, as shown here. Ironically, compared to the 2013 flood, that spill continued down to the lower part of the screen, which is to the west or northwest, and ultimately overtopped at what is now the Table Mesa Park and Ride for the RTD and flowed into the West Valley. This is just the scenario that we saw happening in 2013 and likely the scenario that would happen in the future without some kind of flood mitigation plan. Looking now at the 2013 flood, here's a map from the city comparing the 2013 flood extent, which is in light blue, to the modeled 100-year flood event, which is the darker blue. Now you can't see a whole lot of the darker blue, and with my mouse here, I'm tracing from the south or the bottom. This is where South Boulder Creek is coming. You can see it goes by the CU South property that I've identified, crosses Route 36, and South Boulder Creek then stays over to the right and heads up this way and merges with Boulder Creek right up here near the top of the screen. Within South Boulder Creek itself, you can see there's not much difference between the light blue and dark blue. What that suggests is, as shown here, that the 2013 event was less than a 100-year flood event, but estimated somewhere between a 50-year event and a 100-year event. Some of the main differences are in the West Valley, which I'm circling with my mouse right here, kind of in the center of the screen, in which the 100-year event actually covers a slightly larger extent. Now, in contrast, if we look up at the top where my mouse is, you can see a big difference between the dark blue shading and the light blue shading. And this is in the downtown Boulder area, and this is flooding from Boulder Creek itself. But we're talking about South Boulder Creek today, and so not a whole lot different between the 2013 flood and a 100-year event, but it's thought to be slightly less than a 100-year event. Long before the 2013 flood, mitigation plans went into play for the South Boulder Creek itself. This is a simple timeline taken from a previous city presentation on the different phases of flood mapping. I know many of us are very frustrated about how slow the process has gone. And in fact, even this timeline itself is close to 20 years long. This represents at least three of the major components that occur in almost every flood mapping project. The first would be flood mapping and flood mitigation. The first is a flood mapping aspect. As you can see here, that started in about 2003. I was one of the citizens who were on a technical advisory committee panel during this time period to oversee the work being done on doing modeling and mapping and the climatology work that occurred. Those studies were finished in 2009. The city then embarked right after that onto the flood mitigation master planning. And that ended in 2015, the end of the middle box. And unfortunately, I wasn't involved during part of that time, and I've come to regret that, to be honest. The guiding principles was next. That's something unique to Boulder. And those related both to guiding principles for the flood mitigation construction as well as annexation. The last aspect is the conceptual design report, and that was completed in 2018. And that's as far as this presentation goes, because it was given in 2018 or 2019. Following that, though, of course, the city engineers hired by the city are moving into the geotechnical designs and construction designs, and those are expected to occur over the next couple of years. And I'll give you a schedule on that coming up in just a minute. Let me show you a little bit more about the South Boulder Creek flood mitigation plan itself. This is kind of a busy slide, so let me go over it in some detail with you. First of all, of course, this is a map of part of the city, and now it's turned sideways, so north is to the right. South Boulder Creek, it goes across the middle of the slide, so south would be on the left-hand side where my mouse is. And this light brown area is the alluvium or the floodplain of South Boulder Creek. And generally speaking, it's not very wide. You can see on the bottom right of the screen is a scale that's in thousands of feet. So we're looking at about a half a mile in most areas. Right where my mouse is here near the left edge of that red box, it's constricted quite a bit because of a berm at the CU South property, down to about 1,000 feet wide. I know there's been a lot of interest in the concept of using the natural environment, wetlands, lakes, things like that, to try to provide mitigation for South Boulder Creek. And if you think of it in the context of how wide that floodplain is, that light brown area is, compared to, if you remember the 1969 photo we just showed, and certainly in 2013, the map that we showed, is that during a flood, even less than 100-year magnitude, the entire floodplain of South Boulder Creek fills up, at least the entire floodplain upstream of Route 36, which is at the right edge of the box. So there really isn't a whole lot of opportunity to invoke natural mitigation measures, unfortunately, for this particular watershed. As shown in the title slide of this slide, there are 3 phases that were envisioned as part of this master plan. Again, finished in 2015. And those are shown by the red box on the left, the yellow box in the center, and the green box on the right. And those would be phases 1, 2, and 3, respectively. All the work so far has been working on phase 1, and it terminates just upstream of Route 36, which is the black line here you can see traversing from the bottom left of the diagram up to the center. And that's where most of our focus has been. Phase 2 is intended to affect parts of the West Valley area. It's not even on the city's planning horizon, so it's thought of as being something 20 or 30 years into the future, but there's no budgeting or planning for that. And then the third phase, you can see here, it's in the green box. It's centered on Arapahoe Road. Again, this is an east-west road going through this. That's even further in the future still. So I anticipate that few of us will be alive when phase 3 happens, and that may be the case too when phase 2 is around. So let's focus on the phase 1 flood mitigation plan, the current plan. Here again is another picture of the 100-year flood extent shown in light blue. And again, north is to the right, so west is at the top of the screen in this case. We've got Route 36 here on the left-hand side traversing across. By and large, as shown in this bullet, the Phase 1 flood mitigation plan, its main goal is to eliminate the flooding in the West Valley area. So let me explain what that is. South Boulder Creek itself flows, and here's Highway 93 where my mouse is tracing, so just to the right of the black north arrow. When South Boulder Creek crosses Highway 93, it tends to hug the east side of the valley. So there's a slight bluff outside of the blue area, which is the flooded zone. And when it gets to Route 36, then it starts to traverse more the center or other parts of the watershed. But this is where South Boulder Creek is itself. Largely because of the configuration of Route 36 and that spilling that occurs upstream of Route 36, where I'm circling my mouse, and the topography causes a spillage out of the banks of South Boulder Creek and flows to the northwest. And this is now where the Foothills Parkway comes into Route 36 and overtops roughly behind the RTD Park and Ride, and then flows in this area behind the words Foothills Parkway. This whole area then shown in blue would be referred to generally as the West Valley. It's topographically low, not quite as low as the South Boulder Creek elevations, but it's still quite low. So perhaps at one time it was where South Boulder Creek flowed. So this area has been ripe for flooding, and during all the significant floods that have occurred that we looked at on the previous graph, this West Valley area has been flooded. So in retrospect, if the city planners had to do it over again, should they have built in this area? Well, from a hydrologic point of view, the answer is no, they really shouldn't have. And so today, this Phase 1 flood mitigation, which is a fairly costly undertaking, is mostly to prevent flooding in that particular area. So let's look at the conceptual diagram in some detail now. Here's a cartoon diagram. I'd like to walk you through the different elements of this. And I know many of you attending tonight are very familiar with this. We've been wrestling with this for several years. I think it was a wake-up call to a lot of us when the flood mitigation master plan came out in 2015. Starting in around 2016, 2017, there's been a lot of activity starting around that time and continuing to this day. For those of you not familiar, though, let me walk you through the different elements. So in this map, we're looking north is up, so a typical configuration. On the very lower left-hand side of the slide is Highway 93 coming down where my mouse is going. And then traversing across the top diagonally across is Route 36. And then South Boulder Creek traverses here in the light blue dashed that I'm inscribing with my mouse. So the conceptual elements of the Phase 1, Variant 1 conceptual design are the following. and the Variant 1 is the end result of a lot of permutations on possible designs. The latest iterations were, I think, up to 3 variants, and so this is the variant that was selected. And then in addition, the current design is to withhold just a 100-year flood, even though previously it was to withhold a 500-year flood, a much larger flood. So the first aspect is a flood wall along Route 36. And so that's this darker brown feature right here where I'm inscribing with my mouse, a couple thousand feet long, and it would stick up about 8 feet or so above the ground level. And that's the height required to detain the floodwaters behind it. And those floodwaters, as modeled on this diagram, are shown in the darker blue right behind it, in this area here, and then also areas to the left. So there's Route 36. The second aspect is the flood wall connects into an earthen dam. And so this very thin line, which is the flood wall, and the flood wall itself is not going to be very, very wide at all, goes into an earthen dam, and that's this large brown burnt orange area right here that I'm inscribing with my mouse. That would be just earth fill. So those are the two parts that are what we can think of as traditionally as the dam that would withhold the water or detain the floodwaters. Another aspect of this, which is very controversial, is shown in yellow. And that's fill that would be added to the CU South property. It's tens of thousands of cubic yards. And the idea here is that it would raise this part of the CU South property, which, by the way, is inscribed with these heavy dashed black lines. That's the CU South property. Going around with my mouse here. This part that would be the fill would raise this part of the land up to above the 500-year flood elevation. The areas south of it, which are just this gray color from the air photo, are themselves already above the 500-year flood elevation. Another component of this phase one, variant one design, is in order to provide for enough detention storage for the volume of the floodwaters, part of that area near the fill zone actually has to be excavated. And it's a little hard to see, but it's this area with the crosshatched yellow that I'm encircling with my mouse here. It's a fairly large area, quite a few acres, and it'll have to be dug down to essentially the water table, which isn't very deep. Well, in fact, it has to be dug down below the water table to provide enough storage volume. And so because it will be below the groundwater table, at its upstream side, shown here to the south, west, and east sides, pretty much all around it, will have to be an impermeable wall constructed and built around this detained area. So the floodwaters will come in, they'll spill over the banks of South Boulder Creek, spill in about this area like we saw in the 1969 flood, and move to the northwest. And instead of then flowing over this area where I'm showing with my mouse near the park and ride, they'll actually be detained by both the flood wall and then this earthen dam. And so the waters will back up, and about where this heavy dark blue area is here, including the excavation area, and then behind the flood wall here, is what the hydraulic modeling has shown to be the extent for the 100-year flood. The height of the flood wall and the earthen berm are sized to only withstand or withhold the 100-year event. So flows that are higher than that will overtop. And in fact, the flood wall is being designed to allow overtoppage and it not be eroded. So any kind of flood event will then overtop, go towards Route 36 and run down Route 36. And again, it's a higher ground right near South Boulder Creek. And so the flow would be to the northwest. And then it would presumably flow into the West Valley as the current floods have done in the past. Down here on the bottom right of the slide are some example costs. And the flood mitigation cost for this variant is $41 million. The earth fill shown in yellow is $15 million. And then because of other incidental impacts, for example, under the fill, if you look closely, you can see some coloration. That's where the tennis courts are. And so the 15 million, that bottom line, would cover cost to replace the tennis courts and the roadways and other facilities that are there that may be damaged by this. And so it leaves us a total cost of $66 million for this conceptual design. These were 2018 numbers. They undoubtedly will go higher. Peter mentioned at the beginning that I'm part of the Water Resources Advisory Board. I'm speaking here, of course, on my own behalf, not on the board's behalf. But one thing the board looks at very carefully are citywide flood mitigation efforts and costs. This is far and away the biggest cost by a factor of 3 to 10 compared to any other flood mitigation work going on in the city. So it's painful to see these numbers, particularly when we consider that $25 million of the $66 million is not actually going to flood mitigation itself, should this design actually come to pass. Here's a cartoon view from some of the city slides. Now we're hovering above the park and ride at Table Mesa, looking over Route 36 in the near ground, and we're looking southeast. And this is conceptually what that detention basin would look like right after the flood. So it's filled up. That's the blue area here shown in the center of the screen. The orange, where my mouse is going, is the earthen berm part. We can't really see the flood wall part. It's just not shown here. And so this is a view on a nice sunny day after the massive flood, just to give you a perspective on what it may look like. This variant was selected in part because its ability to withstand that 100-year flood and viewed as being the most cost-effective. It also was selected in part because it had the least environmental impacts. So here's a slide that the Open Space Board of Trustees has pored over quite a bit, and I'd like to share with you what some of the anticipated environmental impacts are. They include 7.7 acres of wetlands impacts, and the wetlands are shown in light green. For example, there's one here just above the key on the map There's a few over here on the right-hand side by South Boulder Creek. Assumed to affect almost 4 acres of Preble's Meadow jumping mouse habitat. And that's a larger area with crosshatched yellow shown on this diagram, covering pretty much the whole eastern half of the diagram. But 3.9 acres would be those affected by the project. And in this case, the project impacts are anticipated, are outlined in purple. So this rectangular element that I'm showing with my mouse would be the impacts associated with that flood wall. This area here is where the detention basin would be. And this area here, just above the legend, would be where the fill is. And then finally, the third major category of impacts that were looked at is the impacts to habitat for the Ute Lady's truss orchid, which is, of course, a threatened and endangered species. And that is shown in the red cross-hatching, again, principally on the right-hand side of the slide, and is about 2.5 acres, according to the estimates. There are 2 elements that are sticking points that I'd like to spend just a moment sharing with you all. One of them is this. The Variant 1 flood wall, that part that goes right along Route 36, requires CDOT approval. CDOT is the Colorado Department of Transportation. Originally, the flood wall was going to be within the CDOT right-of-way, but I'll tell you more about that story in a minute. So the flood wall, imagine, is south of and parallel to Route 36. But without that gap between those two being filled, water that spills over South Boulder Creek will just flow between the gap, between the flood wall, down gradient or north of the flood wall and south of Route 36, and march along its way as if the flood wall weren't there. So to remediate that, a connecting wall has to be built. So here's a zoom now of Route 36. The blue area, light green blue area would be the flooded area during 100-year flood. And this darker area is the underpass where South Boulder Creek is itself. And what I'm circling right now is where this connector wall would have to go. Let me show you that in cross section here down below. We've got Route 36 on the right-hand side at the top. And then, so to the upstream or to the south is on the left-hand side, and then to the north is on the right-hand side. We'd have both, shown in blue is impermeable drilling and concrete that would go to bedrock. And then above that would be the above ground flood wall part. And this majority of this would then have to be traversing CDOT property. Now, that sounds fine, except for this. A fairly busy side over here, but I want to share with you that in September of 2019, CDOT wrote this letter, and here's a copy of the letter shown on the screen, that they would not allow any above ground structures to be within their right-of-way, and that furthermore, no structures could be within the roadway prism. And that involves a slightly larger area than their direct right-of-way. And yet this flood wall has to go through and across that area. Previously, the flood wall was actually going to be within the CDOT right-of-way, and because of this letter, then the city had to move the flood wall to be just outside of that domain. And yet this connecting wall, which is a critical element of the flood wall success, directly violates this written letter from CDOT. So that begs the question, here it is on the bottom, what if CDOT says the connecting wall is not acceptable? We've been assured by the city utility director, Joe Tadeucci, that they are having negotiations with CDOT, and they anticipate an acceptance of this connecting wall. But if not, what do we do next? So it's really something to keep an eye on over the next 6 months to a year, because hopefully we'll have a decision at that point. A second concern with the flood wall is this. The flood wall itself, again, this is the thing right along Route 36, requires a groundwater conveyance system. Here's a kind of a busy drawing from the conceptual design report. This is actually an engineering design report. So let me add some color to it so you can see what I'm talking about. In this case, again, we're looking to the west, kind of as a cross section through the flood wall. And so south or upstream is to the right, and then Route 36 is to the north or to the right. I'm sorry, upstream is to the left. So here's the ground surface in brown. There's Route 36 there on the right or to the north. And this is relatively accurate topography. Here's bedrock conceptually shown in purple. And then here's the groundwater table. So you can see it's a few feet, probably 2 to 5 feet below the ground surface, and that's what we would expect. And so this is what we would be the ambient or existing current condition. So groundwater in this case would flow from the south roughly to the north, same way the South Boulder Creek flows itself. So that's shown by the blue arrow. And here now that I put in orange is the flood wall, a cross section of the flood wall itself. It extends down below bedrock, is keyed into bedrock, as they call it, and it's impermeable. And so you'd wonder, well, so it's actually a subsurface dam as well as being an above ground dam. So this thin aspect is the flood wall that we would see from Route 36, but down below it is a slightly larger and again impermeable zone. So the subsurface dam is going to completely block the flow of groundwater flowing to it. So to avoid that from occurring, there has to be this groundwater conveyance system. And that's shown partly here. It's envisioned to be gravel-filled permeable trenches, and then at periodic junctures, and they parallel both the upstream and downstream sides of the flood wall. And then at periodic junctures, there'd be pipes that would actually be bored through the impermeable flood wall to connect these two. So the idea is these gravel-filled rectangular trenches would collect the groundwater. It would be piped under natural gradients through the flood wall and then discharge on the down gradient side. That makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a very workable solution under these current conditions. But let's think for a second, what happens when we have a flood? Well, now I've just added in blue here, this is the maximum pool elevation. In other words, the elevation of the 100-year flood. And notice again, it's key to be pretty much exactly the height of the flood wall itself. So any flood higher than 100 years is going to overtop. And overall then, the height of that at the peak of the 100-year flood, as I've shown here, is going to be somewhere in the order of 10 to 15 feet above the natural groundwater level. So for the time in which the flood is detained by this flood wall system, the phase one system, and before it's able to drain out at the down gradient edge, as part of the design, you'll have a large body of water sitting right behind the flood wall. And that water in part is going to want to discharge through this groundwater conveyance system. So really the questions are, will that conveyance system under normal conditions actually route or convey enough water to maintain current water levels? That's an important question because on both sides of the flood wall, in fact, on both sides of Route 36, is critical wet meadows, and they require a fairly shallow groundwater level. So if the conveyance system doesn't work under ambient conditions, we're going to have areas either flooded on the upstream side or dried up on the downstream side, or both. And so we'll have a loss of critical habitat.
So Gordon, this is Peter. It's now 8 o'clock. I'm hoping you're going to wrap up soon, so we'll have time for Gary, and we've already got 10 good questions for you.
Gotcha. I'm almost done here. I've got one more.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so this question on the down gradient side, and then most importantly, how will this work under both the ambient conditions and also flood conditions? So there's a real question there and a real concern. Moving quickly to the schedule of events, here it is. I've highlighted the ones that are city council meetings in red. This came out, I think, just last Friday or Friday before at a process subcommittee for CU South. This involves both flood mitigation related and also annexation related meetings. And so the July 20th and August 24th are more pertaining to annexation questions. And then we'll get our conceptual design sometime in October. Also at the very bottom, I've just added these CU South process subcommittee meetings are at monthly junctures, as you can see here. So that's all I wanted to say for now about this South Boulder Creek flood mitigation. Just last slide here on other developments in the watershed. Here's a zoom of part of South Boulder Creek with Arapahoe Road in about the bottom third. You can see here where my mouse is going, and South Boulder Creek on the right-hand side. One of the developments that's currently happening has been, or maybe still is called the Waterview development. It's shown right here, so it's right adjacent to South Boulder Creek and just north of Arapahoe. And it's at that address shown here. It's going to be a fairly high density development with affordable homes and all the rest, but a fairly high density development. As you can see, 317 units is the current plan. Fill has been added to the property to raise it above the 100-year floodplain. This map again is both of the 2013 flood extent and also the 100-year flood extent. So the 100-year flood extent is shown in dark blue. The 2013 flood extent was shown in light blue. And as you can see here, this land was completely flooded in 2013. If you look carefully, you can see this area within the red circle is kind of a funny color. This is area not part of the 100-year flood extent. So it suggests that maybe that 100-year flood map isn't the most accurate. There's going to be the first public hearing on this development, proposed development, on March 4th, just this coming week. And also, this is part of the East Boulder Subcommunity Planning Area, which starts, I think, at Arapahoe and goes north. I know some of the plans that have been discussed include fairly high density development. So it's a question of how would they work within such a high flood zone. I think 57% of that East Boulder Subcommunity Planning Area is within the 100-year floodplain. So to summarize, South Boulder Creek flooding has occurred and will continue to occur. And the climate change suggests that it'll actually occur more frequently and perhaps with greater veracity. So the 100-year events will occur even more frequently than they have historically. The phase 1 flood mitigation plan for CU South is currently just for 100-year flood. And it's only for the main stem flooding of South Boulder Creek itself. And so it won't protect against flooding from any of the tributaries. And they were thought to be a contributor, of course, to the West Valley flooding from 2013. And then as a final kind of rhetorical question, should future development within the watershed be limited in order to reduce impacts to flooding on existing properties and existing residents? With that, thank you very much. I've put my email there at the bottom. We'll have Q&A here today, but if you've got other questions, feel free to contact me at that email address. Thank you.